I will say, so in the geology department, we're getting feedback that in a normal semester, if you have like a weekly assignment, maybe there's a weekly problem set, or maybe there's a biweekly journaling exercise or something, students are very aware of busy work right now. Busy work is not playing well in the pandemic world. And I know all of us would like to think that nothing that we assign is busy work, but that's not what our students think. And so you have to look really closely at the connections between your learning objectives and your assignments and your quizzes and your exams. They all need to be beautifully scaffolded, and they need to follow one from the other. Otherwise, students are going to think that it's busy work.
Right.
Wow. That's really interesting. It's taking it down to the most bare necessity, but also building it up so that it flows well.
Lego.
Yeah.
It really is Lego, which is, the theme that you all chose for your summer workshop.
And the devil is really in the details when it comes to something like that, especially as you describe the way you do the 6 quizzes, right? Because 6 quizzes in, you can
sounds like
say
a lot
that.
of work. Yeah,
it sounds like
every
a lot
other
of work.
week,
but
right?
now let's say, okay, it's 20 minutes. It's drop 2, and now it becomes something else. So I think, and that's the other thing.
And those quizzes get them ready for the final exam, right? So in each of those quizzes is a question that's similar to what they're going to see in the final exam. So again, you want to make it really scaffolded so it's building on itself, but then you also want to be super explicit to the students so the students understand that this is why you're doing what you're doing. And that's something that I feel like was important before COVID, and now it's just essential. Like, they have to understand why you're choosing to do what you're doing.
It's interesting that there's a book on storytelling that I've read, Wired for Story, which basically says that if you're creating a course, or if you're creating a short story or a screenplay, everything has to be answered. You set something up, it's got to be answered. And what you just said really is almost the theme of that book.
And it's difficult because I think as a scientist, we feel like that's too basic. It's too easy, right? When we were taught, I can't speak for all of you guys, but when I was taught, you were lectured at for 50 minutes and you had no idea which part of that or the textbook or the primary literature was going to be on the exam. So, it was the opposite of explicit. It was completely, opposite of transparent. It was completely opaque. And so it's really hard, I think, for me and for some folks in my generation to try to make it this basic, but there's an elegance to it too. And the analogy that I use as a scientist is that I am that basic about my science. So when I explain my methods or my results in science, I want a reviewer to know that A led to B, B led to C, C led to D, and so on. So I make my science super clear. Why wouldn't I do that with my teaching? Why would I purposefully sort of obfuscate my teaching when I could make it as straightforward as I make my research?
Because it used to be, a fraternal order, and you obfuscated things because you were setting bars so that people had to leap over them.
Form of academic hazing, right?
Exactly. Yeah. I mean, my daughter's going through that now. But.
It sounds like a much different message that you're sending your students through each lesson when you're being that explicit about like what the expectations are for the class and like what you're testing them on. Do you think they're going to be coming away from these classes with a different understanding of the material or a different perspective on geology as a whole? Because of these changes?
I really hope that they come away with a different perspective on geology and science as a whole. So for many of these students, this Call 200 is the only science course they're going to take in college. And so, woven into that class, even before COVID, woven into that class is really big lessons on how science works and how scientists think and how they communicate, or sometimes how we fail to communicate. And so that was already a really important thread of the course. I think, with our current political climate in this country, with a number of the challenges that we're facing, it's so incredibly important that our students leave their one science class with sort of an understanding and appreciation of what science is and what it isn't, what it can do and what it can't do. And so I do feel like that's an important part of what we're teaching here. And there's also a little bit of, showing students the people behind the curtain. So if you make a Wizard of Oz analogy and you're meeting the wizard behind the curtain in the Emerald City, you can say that that's true about science. You can also say that that's true about professors. I think it's always helpful for students to see a little bit of us as people. It's helpful for them to see a little bit of us in terms of a career. It makes students realize that we're human, right? That we're capable of making mistakes and we're capable of admitting when we make mistakes. And so I've always enjoyed breaking down those barriers when I can.
How do you do that? What are some ways you do that?
I'm an idiot in the classroom. I mean, no, seriously.
To get to know you as a professor, the human side of it, what are things that you've employed to?
I definitely have a persona when I'm teaching, and part of that persona is being goofy, being geeky and goofy, and just allowing myself to get super excited about my science and about my fossils, and then letting that really shine out to the students. I am a big believer in sharing anecdotes. I think if you are up there teaching and you're not sharing anecdotes about your life or other people's lives, it's a missed opportunity because it humanizes science. It humanizes this endeavor that we're all a part of. And so I'm big into the sort of goofy persona. I'll jump up on the table, not during COVID, wave my arms around. I'll have us do experiments with pennies that make a huge rattle. I'll come out with some folksy, ridiculous phrase that they can make fun of and make a quote board for. Like, part of it is being able to make fun of yourself, and that in and of itself breaks down boundaries. When I first started teaching, I found it really hard to talk about myself personally. I'm in a field that when I entered it, paleontology was probably 16% female. And so I have faced, fascinating gender biases throughout my career. And, honestly, when I first got to William and Mary, it was really difficult to say something like my husband, or after I had my daughter, my daughter. And so it's taken me a long time to feel comfortable talking about work-life balance in the classroom. I don't lecture on it, but it'll come up. Or, saying an aside about what my daughter's doing, or saying an aside about what my husband's doing. Letting that private life come out a little bit, not in any kind of inappropriate way, but a little bit, is also a way of humanizing what it is that we do. It's a way of showing students, that we're trying to keep a work-life balance. That's part of what we struggle with as adults as well. It's a really interesting balance, because I think a lot of people in my generation aren't super comfortable with sharing, but a lot of my current students would really like me to share. And in recent years, in course evaluations, I get a lot of positive feedback for being human and for sharing, and I find it really hard, but students seem to really care about it. So whether it's admitting that I'm, stressed about the election, or whether it's admitting that I'm scared about COVID, as a woman in a science that's male-dominated, it's really hard to show vulnerability, because my entire career is about not being vulnerable. And so getting in the classroom and doing that is something that I've had to be careful about, and I've had to practice a little bit, and it still feels slightly uncomfortable to me.
That's a whole nother podcast.
We could talk for another hour on
I would love to talk. I would love to take maybe January.
That's such a hard place to kind of leave it, but it seems like an appropriate place to stop.
Yeah, and